For all of history, men have fought wars. With war comes fallen soldiers. For most nations, the fallen were buried where they fell on the battlefield. For most of its history, the United States has been different. The United States feels a responsibility to bring the missing home. It is we the people who sent our soldiers to defend us, thus our responsibility to return them. We believe that it is the right of the dead to come home. This has not always been true. During the Mexican War of 1848, the American dead were buried where they fell. Few were brought home, none at the government's expense. The United States' feeling of responsibility, however, would soon change. The Civil War shifted Americans' belief in their responsibility to recover and return their fallen soldiers. Over 600,000 Americans died in the war, the largest amount of Americans ever killed in one war. The Union and the Confederacy had no organized way to dispose of the dead. Most men were buried where they fell, if buried at all. Many of their comrades felt the responsibility to do better for their missing peers. Many marked and mapped the graves of their friends. As the war concluded, the families of the missing and the dead demanded information about their loved ones, insisting they had sent their sons to war and they wanted them back. The fallen were scattered across the South on thousands of battlefields. Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs decided something had to be done. Meigs divided the southern war zones into 3 sections and assigned a staff to recover the Union dead. Quartermaster Edward Whitman was assigned to the Deep South. A deeply patriotic man, he poured himself into his new responsibility. He requested that Union veterans send in information about where they had buried their comrades. Nearly 24,000 responded to the call. Thousands of grave locations were identified. Whitman and his team of morticians exhumed thousands and took them to one of the new national cemeteries Meigs had established, including Arlington National Cemetery. When possible, soldiers were identified, either by the letters of veterans or by markings on the clothing or graves of the dead. These recovery trips continued until 1870. Through back-breaking work and at the expense of $4 million, approximately 300,000 Union soldiers were exhumed, over half identified and reburied in the new cemeteries. For the first time, the nation used its resources, long after the conclusion of a war, to recover, identify, and bury its dead. The nation's feeling of responsibility drastically changed following the Civil War. The Spanish-American War, the first fought overseas, would bring more changes. Those killed were buried on foreign soil. This bothered many Americans. They felt that it was the right of the soldier to be buried at home. President McKinley felt a responsibility to bring home the men he had sent to war, including the fallen. For 15 years, Arlington Cemetery landscaper D.H. Rhodes and others searched Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines for fallen soldiers to bring home. It was one of the first times since the ancient Greeks at Troy that a nation was returning its dead from overseas. A new war with new challenges was on the horizon. The United States would endure over 100,000 fatalities during the Great War. The Graves Registration Service was established to fulfill the responsibility to the dead. The task of returning all of the dead to the United States was difficult and expensive. A new policy was implemented. The families of fallen soldiers could choose whether their loved ones would be brought home or buried in a new national cemetery in Europe. Over half of the families chose to have their loved ones brought back to the United States. This policy changed little with World War II. After World War II, the Registration Service used a 4-step method of finding the missing dead. The service was divided into 4 teams. The first team requested information from locals about possible American graves, while the second investigated these leads. The third team exhumed the dead and took them to the Central Identification Laboratory in France, where the fourth team attempted to identify the remains and notify families. This proved successful in the European theater, with 25,000 of the 30,000 missing in Europe identified. In the Pacific theater, geography, poor record keeping, language barriers, and cultural differences were a challenge to the service. Relatively few of the missing were found. America's responsibility, however, would be put on hold with the coming of another war. When the Korean War ended, the armistice divided the war zone in half. For the first time in its history, the United States did not control the battlefields at the end of a war. This prevented almost half of the missing from being found and identified. North Korea refused almost all efforts by the United States to exchange the dead. The United States' responsibility to bring back its fallen continued in South Korea. However, it was another 50 years before they were able to search again in the North. The American responsibility would also face obstacles during the Vietnam War. Soldiers were lost in overgrown jungles and rice paddies, making recovery of remains difficult. When the United States left Vietnam in 1973, they permanently established a Central Identification Laboratory, SIL, to fulfill the nation's responsibility to bring its Vietnam patriots home. Like Korea, the fall of Saigon prevented those responsible for recoveries from access to the battlefields. SIL was renamed the Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii and permanently tasked with finding the missing of the Vietnam War. As the Central Identification Laboratory continued its search, family members of those missing from previous wars demanded the same for their loved ones. The United States agreed. The Central Identification Laboratory Hawaii was assigned to find all of the missing from World War II and all wars afterwards. To find those left in Vietnam, the Joint Task Force Full Accounting was established. In 2003, the government decided the process would be more efficient if the two were combined into the new Joint POW/MIA Accounting Command, or JPAC. Today, JPAC's mission is to conduct global search, recovery, and laboratory operations to identify unaccounted for Americans from past conflicts. JPAC deploys teams into the field to find the missing dead. They use meticulous methods similar to those of the Graves Registration Service during World War II. First, intensive research is conducted, including interviews with eyewitnesses and record searches. If there is evidence of a possible grave site, a team is sent to investigate. If deemed worthy of excavation, a team is sent to the site to attempt a recovery. If remains are recovered, they are returned to the SIL in the United States, where anthropologists identify them. If there is definitive evidence of identity, the remains are returned to the family and buried with full military honors. JPAC returns an average of 70 missing service members per year. Today, both JPAC and the Department of Defense's Missing Personnel Office work to fulfill our responsibility to bring home the missing dead. The United States of America feels a responsibility to its fallen, one that has grown since the Civil War. The nation feels that the fallen soldier has the right to come home. It is their right and the nation's responsibility.